So in the previous videos, we have discussed chapter 1 and chapter 2 of grade 12 mathematics based on the new curriculum. Chapter 1, which is sequence in series, we have discussed, and chapter 2, which is introduction to calculus, having 4 parts: differentiation, application of differentiation, integration, and application of integration. We have discussed that chapter 2 also. Doing that, review exercises and problems for chapter 1, 2, and the rest of the chapters will go on. Today, we are going to the new chapter, which is chapter 3 of grade 12 mathematics. What you call it is statistics, of course, based on the new curriculum. So unit 3, which is statistics. Before I go to the definition of this statistics, let me tell you one thing. For all fields, whether it is for natural science and social science, this statistics is very important, especially in the future. ለባሉ ለወደፊቱ ዲፕሎማም የመጀመሪያ ዲግሪም ቴክኒክና ሙያም ሁለተኛ ዲግሪም ሶስተኛ ዲግሪ የፈለጋችሁትን ሰርቲፊኬሽን ስትማሩ መጨረሻ ላይ ሪሰርች ፔፐር ታዘጋጃላችሁ። ያ ሪሰርች ፔፐር ለማዘጋጀት ደግሞ ቁጥር አንድ የሚያስፈልጋችሁ what equality is statistics ነው። ስለዚህ ሶሻልም ናቹራልም ለፈተና ብቻ ሳይሆን ለአጠቃላይ ዕውቀት ብላችሁ ለወደፊቱ ይጠቅመናል ብላችሁ ይሄ ስታቲስቲክስ ኮርስን በደንብ አድርጋችሁ አንደርስታንድ ለማድረግ ሞክሩ። Good. So what do we mean by statistics means? So statistics, it is what? A branch. It is a branch of what? Applied mathematics. So statistics is a branch of applied mathematics which studies about statistics is a branch of applied mathematics which studies about what? Which studies about the collection, organization, presentation, analysis, and interpretation of data. Interpretation of what? Data. This is what most scholars agreed on the definition of statistics. So what's statistics? So statistics is a branch of applied mathematics which studies about the collection of data. Data first must be collected. የመጀመሪያው ስቴፕ ዳታ ኮሌክት መደረግ አለበት። So that collected data should be organized. This is the first step. The second step is organization of data. ኮሌክት የተደረገ ዳታ ምን መደረግ አለበት? ኦርጋናይዝ መደረግ አለበት። it should be edited. ልባርጉ ኤዲት መደረግ አለበት። ማያስፈልግ ካለ መውጣት አለበት። መስተካከል ያለበት ነገር ካለ እዛ ጋር መስተካከል መቻል አለበት። it should be edited and it should be summarized. And arranged by using what? A table. So በታውላር ሜተድ ይህ ኮሌክት የተደረገ ዳታ ምን መደረግ አለበት? ኦርጋናይዝ መደረግ አለበት። it should be edited. አላስፈላጊ የሆኑ ነገሮች መወገድ አለባቸው። it should be summarized. it should be arranged using what? a tabular method. so ኮሌክት የተደረገ ዳታ ሁለተኛ ደረጃ ምን መደረግ አለበት? ኦርጋናይዝ መደረግ አለበት። ኤዲት መደረግ አለበት። የሚያስፈልገው መወገድ አለበት። የሚያስፈልጉት ደግሞ መስተካከል አለባቸው። በሰንጠረዥ መዘጋጀት አለባቸው። then that organized data should be presented. ለአናሊሲስ እንዲመች ተደርጎ መደረግ አለበት። ፕሬዘንት መደረግ አለበት። so that organized data should be presented by using either a graph or what? A diagram. So that organized data should be what? Present መደረግ አለበት። ሶስተኛው ስቴፕ ፕሬዘንቴሽን ነው። so ይህ የፕሬዘንቴሽን ጥቅሙ ደግሞ ለአናሊሲስ ማዘጋጀት ነው። አናሊሲስ is nothing just investigating the given organized or presented data. ስለዚህ ለኢንቨስቲጌሽን ማዘጋጀት መቻል አለብን። ምን በማድረግ? ፕሬዘንት ማድረግ። so presentation of data means nothing preparing that data describing that data by using either a graph or what? A diagram. እነ pictograph, እነ pie chart, እነ histograph የመሳሰሉትን ሜቶዶች ተጠቅመን ያ ኦርጋናይዝ የተደረገው ግራፍ ምን መደረግ አለበት? ፕሬዘንት መደረግ አለበት። So presentation is nothing describing the given graph by using a graph or what? A diagram. Then that present data should be what? Analysis. Analyze መደረግ አለበት. So that present data should be analyzed, should be investigated. For what purpose? For interpretation purpose, for conclusion purpose. Interpretation is nothing giving a conclusion. No. At the end of the day, conclusion መሰጠት አለበት። ዳታ ከተሰበሰበ በኋላ ኦርጋናይዝ ከተደረገ በኋላ ፕሬዘንት ከተደረገ በኋላ በግራፍ በፓይ ቻርት በፒክቶግራፍ በሂስቶግራፍ ቀርቦ ፕሬዘንት ከተደረገ በኋላ አናላይዝ ይደረጋል። ግራፍ አናላይዝ የሚደረግበት ምክንያት ኢንቨስቲጌት የሚደረግበት ምክንያት for what purpose? For interpretation purpose ነው። መጨረሻ ላይ ኢንተርፕሬት ማድረግ መቻል አለብን። ኮንክሉዥን መስጠት መቻል አለብን። ስለዚህ እነዚህ አምስቱ ፕሮሰሶች ረን የሚያደርግልን branch of applied mathematics. What we call it is statistics. So statistics is a branch of applied mathematics which studies about the collection, organization, presentation, analysis, and what? Interpretation of what? Data. So don't forget that statistics is nothing. It is a branch of applied mathematics which studies about collection, organization, presentation, analysis, and what? Interpretation of that. Now, that collected data can be classified into two groups. So data በስንት እንከፍላቸዋለን? በሁለት. There are two types of data. What and what? Ungrouped data and ungrouped data and what? Grouped data ብለን በሁለት እንከፍላቸዋለን። አሁን ኢምፖርታንት ነው። አንደኛ ኒውሜሪካል ቫልዩስ ስንፈልግ ግሩፕ ዳታ ሲሆንና ግሩፕ ዳታ ሲሆን የተለያየ ፎርሙላ ስለሚመጣ ስለዚህ አንደርስታንድ ማድረግ መቻል አለባችሁ። So anyway, ungrouped data and what? Grouped data. Ungrouped data are those data which are in their original form. So ungrouped data are those data which are in their what? Original what? Form. In their original form. ስለዚህ አሁን ቀደም what is statistics? A branch of applied mathematics which studies about collection of data. የመጀመሪያው በስታቲስቲክስ ውስጥ የመጀመሪያው ስራ ምንድነው? ዳታን ኮሌክት ማለት። ያ ኮሌክት የተደረገው ዳታ in their original form ምንም ሳይስተካከል ምንም ሳይቀናበር ምንም ሰመራይዝም ኦርጋናይዝም ሳይደረግ ያለው ፎርም ምን ተብሎ ይጠራል? In their original form. Sometimes these ungrouped data are called raw data ተብሎ ይጠራል። raw data ለምሳሌ አሁን ሚስተር ኤክስ 70 አምጥተዋል፣ ሚስተር ዋይ 12 አምጥተዋል፣ ሚስተር ዜድ 32 አምጥተዋል፣ ሚስተር ደብሊው ለምሳሌ 15 አምጥተዋል፣ ሚስተር ኦ ፎር ኤግዛምፕል 12 እንደዚህ ምንም ኦርጋናይዝ ሳይደረግ ያለበት ፎርም what you call it is ungrouped data. But when that ungrouped data, when that collected data are arranged and summarized in a frequency distribution or in a tabular representation, what you call it is group data ብለን እንጠራዋለን። በታቡላር ሪፕሬዘንቴሽን ወይም በቴብል በፍሪኩዌንሲ ዲስትሪቢዩሽን ቴብል አሬንጅ ኤንድ ሰመራይዝ ተደርጎ ሲቀርብ ያ ኮሌክት የተደረገው ዳታ ምን ተብሎ ይጠራል? ግሩፕ ዳታ። So when that collected data are described or presented or arranged in a frequency distribution table. In a frequency distribution what? Table. In a frequency distribution table. ስለዚህ ያ የተሰበሰበ ዳታ በፍሪኩዌንሲ ዲስትሪቢዩሽን ቴብል አሬንጅ ሲደረግ ሰመራይዝ ሲደረግ ኦርጋናይዝ ሲደረግ ምን ተብሎ ይጠራል? ግሩፕድ ዳታ። ዳታው ግሩፕ ተደርጓል ብለን እንጠራለን። ስለዚህ መለየት አለባችሁ። ungrouped data, those data which are in their original form, which are not arranged, which are not summarized. Group data which are arranged, which are summarized in a frequency distribution table. Good. So these quantitative variables, these collected data should be what? Summarized. Summarize መደረግ አለባችሁ። ሰመራይዝ ለማድረግ ደግሞ ግሩፕ ኦፍ ዳታ ስለሆኑ ምን ያስፈልገናል? ኒውሜሪካል ቫልዩስ ያስፈልገናል። ኒውሜሪካል ቫልዩስ ለማግኘት ደግሞ we have to measure that group of data. ስለዚህ a group of data ምን መደረግ አለባቸው ሜዠር መደረግ አለባቸው by some quantities then ሜዠር ካደረግን በኋላ ኒውሜሪካል ቫልዩ እናገኛለን based on that numerical values ምን ወስዳለን conclusion ወይም summarization ወስዳለን so there are two ways of measuring a given data just to get that numerical value so there are two ways of measuring data so there are two ways of measuring data just to get that numerical values after that a kind of conclusion will be considered so there are two ways of measuring a given data the first one is measures of what central what tendency this measures of central tendency of course focuses on the central values this measures of central tendency focuses on the central values they are called measures of location right they are called what measures of location or they are called measures of what average they are called measures of what average because they focus on the average of the data okay so measures of central tendency what you call they are measures of location or what you call they are measures of average they focus on the central values they focus on the average of the data ስለዚህ የዳታው የተሰበሰበው ዳታ አጠቃላይ average calculate እናደርግና then a kind of numerical value እናገኛለን from that numerical value እነሳና ምን እናደርጋለን conclusion እንወስዳለን the most frequently used measures of central tendency are arithmetic mean which is the median that means after arranging the data either in ascending order or descending order then the data which is at the middle of the data that means ዳታዎቹን እኩል ለሁለት የሚከፍል value what you call it is the median and the most frequently appeared data what you call it is the mode and the quartiles the deciles right and the percentiles these are the most frequently used numerical values which are used to measure the central tendency of the given data good so quartiles are nothing those values which divide the given data into 4 equal parts okay quartiles ምንላቸው q1 q2 q3 ብለን የምንላቸው ዳታውን እኩል ስንት ቦታ የሚከፍሉ ናቸው አራት ቦታ የሚከፍሉ 1 2 3 አራት ቦታ የሚከፍሉ ናቸው so after calculating q1 q2 and q3 of course q2 means median ማለት ነው so after calculating q1 q2 and q3 then a kind of summarization or conclusion will take deciles are those values dividing the given data into 10 equal parts 10 እኩል ቦታ የሚከፍሉ ናቸው d1 d2 እስከ d9 ያሉ ናቸው and percentiles are those values dividing the given data into 100 equal parts p1 p2 እስከ p99 ድረስ ያሉ ናቸው ዳታውን እኩል ለስንት ይከፍሉታል ለመቶ ይከፍሉታል ስለዚህ እነዚህ ኒውሜሪካል ቫልዩዎች እነዚህን ኳንቲቲዎች ካልኩሌት እናደርግና median mode quartile decile then some numerical value እናገኛለን based on that numerical value then a kind of conclusion about that data we will just consider ማለት good the second one is measures of dispersion measures of what measures of dispersion or sometimes it's called measures of variation what you call is measures of variation measures of dispersion or measures of variation they tell us how much the data are scattered how much the data are scattered okay let me discuss there so the second one is measures of dispersion measures of what measures of dispersion these measures of dispersion they show that these measures of dispersion they show what they show the scatter okay how much the data are scattered how much the data are what scattered they show the scatter or variation of the data or the variables the data about about the central value which is the average ማለት ስለዚህ የተሰጠንን ቫሪያብል ወይም የተሰጡንን ዳታዎች ከአቨሬጁ ወይም ከሴንትራል ቫልዩ በምን ያህል ዲግሪ ስፕሪድ አድርገዋል በምን ያህል ዲግሪ ስካተር አድርገዋል የሚለውን ሰማራይዜሽን የሚሰጡን ኒውሜሪካል ቫልዩስ what you call they are measures of dispersion ብለን እንጠራቸዋለን these measures of dispersion በሁለት እንከፍላቸዋለን so there are two types of measures of dispersion okay ሁለት አይነት measures of dispersion አሉ ማለት ነው so there are two types of measures of dispersion the first one is absolute measure of dispersion and relative measure of dispersion relative measures of what dispersion there are two types of measures of dispersion what and what absolute measure of dispersion and relative measure of dispersion በሁለት እንከፍለዋለን this absolute measure of dispersion includes the absolute measure of dispersion it includes one range so range is an example of an absolute measure of dispersion second interquartile range the third one mean deviation and the fourth one is standard deviation so this absolute measure of dispersion includes range which is maximum minus minimum of course the interquartile range the mean deviation and the standard deviation the relative measures of dispersion this includes coefficient of range so this relative measures of dispersion includes one coefficient of range second coefficient of quartile deviation third coefficient of mean deviation coefficient no and the fourth one coefficient of what coefficient of standard deviation or coefficient of variation so there are two types of measures of dispersion absolute measures of dispersion and relative measures of dispersion absolute measures of dispersion includes what the range the interquartile range the mean deviation and the standard deviation but the coefficient part the relative measures of dispersion includes coefficient of range, coefficient of quartile deviation, coefficient of mean deviation, and the coefficient of variation or coefficient of what they call it is standard deviation. So let's see one by one these measures of dispersion. The first one is the absolute measure of what? Dispersion. The absolute measure of dispersion. So this absolute measure of dispersion, it measures the variability. It measures the variability. The absolute measure of dispersion, it measures the variability in the same units of the data. So this absolute measure of dispersion measures the variability in the same unit of what? The data. That means if the data are in meter, then the unit of the absolute measure of dispersion is in meter. If the unit of the data are in kilograms, say for example, then the unit of the absolute measure of dispersion is in kilogram. If the unit of the data are in, say for example, in centimeter, then the unit of the absolute measure of dispersion is in centimeters. So the absolute measure of dispersion measures the variability in the same units of what? The data. Okay, so the first one is range. So we are going to treat range for ungroup data and range for group data. Discuss data group data and what? And group data. Group data are those data which are arranged and summarized in a frequency distribution table. And group data are data which are in their original form. So, our range, interquartile range, mean deviation, standard deviation, for group data and ungroup data. Be take care of that. Okay. So range for the first one is for ungroup data. Range for ungrouped data. So range for ungrouped data is, so range is equal to what? Maximum value minus minimum value, which is the simplest measures of dispersion. So range is equal to maximum value minus minimum value. Say for example, if you have been given such data, say 112 or 33, say for example 27, 94 and 150, ለምሳሌ እንደዚህ አይነት ዳታ ቢሰጣችሁ 112 33 27 94 some data corrected from some survey. Okay, so what is the range? And these data are ungrouped data. They are not arranged in a frequency distribution table. So what is the range of these data? So what is the maximum value? The maximum value is what? Which is 150. And the minimum value is what? The minimum value is, which is 27. So the range of this data is 150 minus 27. So which is which is 123. So this is range for ungrouped data. What about range for group data? So range for group data is given by range for group data is, so range is equal to the upper class boundary. The upper class boundary of the highest class. Minus the upper class boundary of the highest class minus the lower class boundary. The lower class boundary of the lowest class. So range is equal to what? So range is the upper class boundary of the highest class minus the lower class boundary of what? The lower class. So after you have prepared a frequency distribution table containing class boundaries, upper class boundary of the highest class minus the lower class boundary of the lower class boundary of the lowest class, what you call it is. Say for example, example in this last. Say for if you have been given a data of students, say for example a test which is out of 30, might be 30 or 40. Okay, now look, suppose the data is given like this. Okay, so here are the values x and here it is a frequency. ለምሳሌ ከ30 ፈተና ፈትኜ say for example ከ5 እስከ 10 ያመጡት፣ ከ10 እስከ 15 ያመጡት፣ ከ15 እስከ 20 ያመጡት፣ ከ20 እስከ 25 ያመጡት፣ ከ25 እስከ 30 ያመጡት ብዬ እንደዚህ አሬንጅ ባደርገው። ኦኬ ናው ከ5 እስከ 10 ያመጡት 3 ተማሪዎች፣ ከ10 እስከ 15 ያመጡት 10 ተማሪዎች፣ say for example ከ15 እስከ 20 ያመጡት ደግሞ 30 ተማሪዎች ቢሆኑና ከ20 እስከ 25 ያመጡት 2 ተማሪዎች፣ ከ25 እስከ 30 ያመጣው ደግሞ 1 ተማሪ ቢሆን ማለት ነው። ኦኬ So if you have been given such types of a grouped data, አሁን ዳታው ግሩፕ ሆነዋል ማለት ነው። ኦኬ ቴስት ነው ከ30 ፈትኜ ነው ከ5 እስከ 10 ያመጡት 3 ተማሪዎች ናቸው። ከ10 እስከ 15 10 ተማሪዎች ናቸው። ከ15 እስከ 20 30 ከ20 እስከ 25 ሁለት እና አሁን ይሄ ለኮንክሉዥን ይጠቅማል። ስለዚህ አሁን ይሄን ኮንክሉዥን ወስና ሚን ሚዲያን ሞድ ሬንጅ those measures of absolute measures of dispersion and relative measures of dispersion calculate እናደርግና ከዛ የራሳችን የሆነ ምን ኮንክሉዥን እንወስዳለን ማለት ነው። Good. Now let's find the range. So range means what? So range is equal to the upper class boundary of the highest class minus the lower class boundary of what? The lowest class. Okay. አሁን ልብ አድርጉ። the highest ይሄ highest class this is highest class ብለን እንጠራዋለን and this one is the lowest class ብለን እንጠራዋለን። ይሄ ከታች ያለው ክላስ ነው which what you call it is lowest class. This one is what you call it is the highest class. So for the lowest class አሁን የዚህ ልብ አድርጉ አሁን የዚህ frequency distribution boundary class አዘጋጁ ክላስ ባውንደሪ ያዘጋጁ ከተባላችሁ ምንድነው የምታደርጉት? ከአምስት ላይ ከሎወር ክላስ ከሎወር ሊሚቱና ከአፐር ሊሚቱ ላይ ምን ታደርጋላችሁ? ከሎወር ሊሚቱ ላይ 0.5 ትቀንሳላችሁ፣ ከአፐር ሊሚቱ ላይ ደግሞ 0.5 ትደምራላችሁ። አሁን የዚህኛው ማለት የዚህኛው ክላስ ባውንደሪ ማለት ምን ማለት ነው? ከአምስት ላይ 0.5 ሲቀነስ 4.5 ከ4.5 እስከ 10.5 ኦኬ። የዚህኛውስ ከ9.5 እስከ 15.5 ኦኬ። የሁሉም እንዲመስላት ይቻላል። አሁን ስለማንፈልጋቸው የሃይስት ክላሱ ባውንደሪ ክላስ እነማን ናቸው? ከ25 ላይ 0.5 ሲቀነስ 24.5 ከ24.5 እስከ 30 ላይ 0.5 ሲጨምሩ 30.5። ስለዚህ አሁን ለዚህ ፍሪኩዌንሲ ዲስትሪቢዩሽን ሎወር ክላስ ባውንደሪው ከአምስት ላይ 0.5 ትቀንሳላችሁ፣ ከ4.5 እስከ 10.5 ነው። ኦኬ ፎር ዘ ሃይስት ክላስ ባውንደሪ ደግሞ the class boundary is ከ25 ላይ 0.5 ሲቀንሱ 24.5 ከ24.5 እስከ 30.5 ይሄ 0.5 what you call it is correction factor ተብሎ ይጠራል። it is correction factor አንዳንድ ስህተቶች ቢኖሩ ለምሳሌ ፖይንት ቤት ቢጠየቅ ለምሳሌ 9.5 7.5 8.5 8.3 የት ነው የሚያርፈው የትኛው ክላስ ላይ ነው የሚያርፈው የሚሉት የመሳሰሉት ጥያቄዎችን ለመመለስ so this correction factor what you call it is 0.5 ከታችኛው መቀነስና ከላይኛው መደመር እንችላለን ነው። so what is the upper class boundary of the highest class is what? 30.5. so this one is 30.5 minus the lower class boundary of the lowest class is what? ከ4.5 እስከ 10.5 ነው። so which is 4.5 ነው። so ከ30.5 ላይ 4.5 ሲቀነስ 4.5 ቀንሳል 0 this is 26 ማለት so the range of this frequency distribution or this group data is given by what? 26 no. So the range of this grouped data is what you call it is 26. Now let's see the advantage and the disadvantage of range. So what is the advantage of? So advantage of range. So the advantage and disadvantage or the limitations of range. What's the advantage of range? The advantage of range is that it is the simplest to calculate. So it is too simple to calculate. It is simple to calculate, all right? Because it's the highest value, the maximum value minus the minimum value, okay? So it is simple to calculate. This is the only advantage of the range. What about the disadvantage or the limitations of range? What are the limitations? Limitations of range. የዚህ የሬንጅ ሊሚቴሽኑ ምንድነው? ድክመቱ ምንድነው? ጉዳቱ ምንድነው? So it only depends on extreme values. First disadvantage is that it only depends on extreme values. ኤክስትሪም ቫሊዩስ ማለት ኤክስትሪም ቫሊዩዎቹ ላይ ብቻ ነው። ኤክስትሪም ማለት ዘ ማክሲመም ኤንድ ኖት ዘ ሚኒመም ማለት ትልቁና ትንሹ ላይ ብቻ ነው ፎከስ የሚያደርገው። ስለዚህ መሀል አካባቢ ያሉ ቫሊዩዎች ኮንሲደር አያደርግም ማለት ነው። መሀል አካባቢ ያሉ ቫሊዩዎች ኮንሲደር አያደርግም። ስለዚህ ምን መረጃ ነው የሚሰጠን መረጃ ስለ ትልቁና ስለ ትንሹ ቫሪየብል ብቻ ነው መረጃ የሚሰጠን። So it only depends on x. That means the second variation it doesn't consider, okay? It doesn't consider the variation of what? The variation አሁን በትልቁና በትንሹ መካከል ያለው ጋፕ ነው የሚነግረን። ልባሉ መካከል ላይ ያሉትስ so it doesn't consider the variation of values in between. ስለዚህ መካከል ላይ ስላሉ ቫልዩዎች መካከል ላይ ስላሉ ቫሪየብሎች ምንም የሚሰጠን መረጃ የለም። This is one of the disadvantage or the limitation of what? And the third one, it is highly affected. It is highly affected by what? Extreme values. It is highly affected by extreme. ስለዚህ ኤክስትሪም ቫልዩዎች ላይ ምን ይሆናል? አፌክትድ ይሆናል። ለምሳሌ በጣም ትልቅ ቢሆንና ማክሲመም ቫልዩ እና ደግሞ ትንሽ ሚኒመም ቫልዩ ቢኖራል ደን ሁለቱን ትቀንሳለህ። ከዚህ ያን ብቻ ታይና ኮንክሉዥናችን ትክክል ላይሆን ይችላል። ለምሳሌ የተማሪዎቹ ተብለን ቢሰጠንና አንድ ተማሪ ብቻ 99 አምጥቶ ሌላው በሙሉ 50 እና 60ዎች ውስጥ ለምሳሌ 60 55 56 ሆኖ አንድ ተማሪ ብቻ ደግሞ 15 ከመቶ ቢያመጣ አሁን ይሄን ዳታ ለባሉ what is range ብንባል ከ99 ላይ 15 እንቀንሳለን 50 እና 60ዎች ውስጥ ስላሉት መረጃ ምንም ነገር አይኖርም ማለት ምንም ነገር አይኖርም። ስለዚህ it is highly affected by what? The extreme values. It doesn't consider the variation of the values in between. So it only depends on what? These are the limitations or the disadvantages of what? The range. The advantage that it is very simple to calculate. The simplest calculation in measures of dispersion is range. Good.